You're good.
Okay. Well, my name is Ed Boles, and I have I've been in Albuquerque and vicinity since 1981, moving here from Kansas at that time, and for the first year of my residence in Albuquerque, living near Nob Hill over in the university neighborhood by the North Campus, and teaching it at the UNM School of Architecture and Planning. And so my first year in Albuquerque, I spent going back and forth to the school, but also looking around Albuquerque. I had never spent any time here before moving here. And Nob Hill was convenient and had some businesses I was interested in. So I spent a fair amount of time in this area, primarily shopping at the food co-op, going to a nice little place called Silver Sunbeam, a gift and card store where I could buy old postcards, things of that sort. And and generally looking at the architecture because it was interesting to me uh, architecturally and design wise. The businesses at that point in the early 80s were kind of spotty in the neighborhood, let's say, but certainly the buildings were pretty much intact from their original design and very interesting to me. And within a few years, I was working in the state Main Street program, starting in 1985 actually, which is the same time that Nob Hill got involved in the Main Street program as one of 6 urban demonstration programs selected by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And so you had here a 3-year revitalization program based on the downtown model that the National Trust and the National Main Street Center had developed. What they were doing, of course, was trying to take the downtown model and apply it to other kinds of commercial areas, such as suburban shopping strips, as you have along Central and Nob Hill. And that was kind of fun because I was working in the state program going around to small towns, but we had the same advisor out of Washington, D.C. as the Nob Hill program did. And she involved us to some degree in meetings in Nob Hill. I actually remember stepping back a little bit here that I attended the city council meeting in Albuquerque when Lieutenant Governor Mike Runnels came to the city council and urged the council to approve funding for the Nob Hill Main Street program, telling them, the council, that the state of New Mexico was going to be doing its own Main Street program. And so these two things came online at the same time. Nob Hill's program, of course, as a publicly funded thing, ran for just 3 years, but they accomplished a lot of work in 3 years' time, both in terms of professional involvement by their planners and leaders, but also a lot of work by volunteers. Um, I'm digressing a little bit now because I want to say a couple more things about my residence in the area. Living in Albuquerque and more recently in Corrales, I've done a fair amount of business in Nob Hill, starting with those old days, that first year at the food co-op and at the Silver Sunbeam, but then many years on, going to a favorite shoe repair store, which is Reuben's Shoe Repair. Reuben is passed now, but over on Amherst near Lomas, there was this man who single-handedly ran a shoe repair business that did really high-quality work. And it was fun to go in and smell the smells of a shoe repair shop and talk with Reuben in there. And so back to the subject of Main Street and Nob Hill and all of that. Actually, when I was wandering around Nob Hill as a resident of the nearby neighborhood, I remember going to the Nob Hill Business Center, which at that point in the early 80s was pretty much vacant. I think the only exception was the grocery store, still in operation there. And I looked into one of the spaces up front and noticed that it had been a pharmacy, but it was clear had been more than just a pharmacy. It was actually a place that sold cosmetics and that sort of thing, because on the walls inside were some very nice neon signs with designs of major cosmetic companies, Max Factor and that sort of stuff. And I was struck by how classy they looked. They weren't lighted or anything, but they were very nicely done. And there was a whole array of them. And I thought, this was a really upscale store at one time. And that began to help me form impressions about the neighborhood and the commercial district as a whole. I was not at that time working in Nob Hill, but I was looking at it and enjoying the architecture and the graphic design embodied in all of its signs. And so that was during my early time in Albuquerque, which was pretty much, well, I want to try and clarify that when I moved to Albuquerque, it struck me right away as a sort of a freewheeling place compared to where I had lived, which was Lawrence, Kansas, a college town in eastern Kansas, much smaller community than Albuquerque, but a more traditional sort of a town based on Eastern models. And coming to Albuquerque, it became clear to me right away that this was a different kind of place, that not only was the form of the city different, but it was also, it looked to me very lively, partly because of the number of small businesses evident on all the commercial strips, and particularly in places like Nob Hill. Lots of small, owner-operated businesses, such as I had never really seen before. And that struck me at the time. And so I only lived in Albuquerque about 5 years before moving to Corrales. I moved to Corrales because I was able to find a house I liked, but also I was working in Santa Fe at that point, and it was convenient to be on the north side of town. So I've lived out there ever since, but my involvement in the State Main Street program, my involvement in the State Historic Preservation Office, and then my involvement as a planner at the City of Albuquerque for a number of years has kept me involved in Nob Hill and actually deepened my involvement in this area because of my work. Starting with Main Street and that little bit of contact I mentioned earlier through the Nob Hill Main Street program and leading up into historic preservation regulatory work, actually. For instance, on projects like the renovation of Monte Vista Elementary School by APS. You know, it's a historically registered building. The state of New Mexico has rules about what you can do with such a building when you want to alter it. And so I was involved in consultations on projects like that. That's the most memorable one in this area. And probably also because it was pretty contentious.
When was that?
Well, I don't
What
remember.
happened?
I don't remember.
Roughly.
The work on the Monte Vista Elementary School that I recall would have been between 1991 and 1995, so early 1990s. There was some renovation work done on the school, and it was fairly, let's say, light touch work. There was no really major change proposed other than a large replacement of windows project. And that was one of the main points of contention, is whether the historic wood windows in the building should be replaced or repaired. And the state's rules suggest that they should have been repaired rather than replaced. But we ended up compromising on allowing a number of windows to be replaced. Most of the ones in the building actually were replaced, but the ones facing the front entrance or on the walls alongside the front entrance were repaired. So you have the wood windows remaining there, and you have replacement windows in all the other banks.
The fact that the school is listed in the National Register did not in itself stimulate the consultation, but it was some state law or rule.
That's right. The Monte Vista Elementary School is listed in both the state registers and National Register. And what triggers the consultation by the State Preservation Office is the expenditure of public money on a state-registered building.
State money, state register.
Exactly.
Got it.
So if it were state money or local public money, local government money, being spent on a public, rather a state registered building, then you have consultation.
There's a widespread concern among people in Nob Hill that the state could close Monte Vista as a school or tear it down. People are very worried about that. It's an icon for Monte Vista.
Monte Vista Elementary School is certainly a landmark of this neighborhood. And, I mean, you could claim it's a landmark of the city of Albuquerque,
Yes.
for that matter. It's a really great example of a developer creating a space for a public school, and then an architect and a school system designing a building that really respond to the site provided and sort of setting the tone for the neighborhood. The architectural style is in keeping with many of the houses nearby. The site design is really striking, I think, because of the way the building faces that fairly acute angle formed by the intersection of Monte Vista and Campus Road. And of course, then right down to the landscaping of that space, which is pretty nicely done. So,
Let me have you just pause for a second.
oh, sure.
Before we get too far,
Mhm.
we want to get that when and where you were born.
Oh,
your
all of that?
parents.
You really want to know that?
We really want that. Your
Okay.
mom and dad, what did they do?
Okay,
How were
fine.
you educated and
Yeah.
why did you come here? and
Right,
when?
okay,
One sec.
good.
And how you've worked. You've talked some about that.
Yeah. Well, the more of that will come out, I'm sure.
Okay.
Well, so the Monte Vista Elementary School has these really distinctive qualities, not to mention the fact that it is historic. I could talk about its visual qualities, but, you know, it's a piece of this, it's a really important piece of this larger puzzle called Nob Hill. And I don't mean to say it's a puzzle exactly, but it's a really sort of complete, designed, suburban neighborhood. And all of its elements are somewhat important, but the school's public buildings are particularly important. And that one, as a registered building and as a rather unusual at this point, an early Albuquerque public school, would seem to be the sort of building the school system would go out of its way to preserve. And they spent a lot of money there through the years, adding a library, making the sorts of improvements I mentioned on the windows, and in other ways, of course. I think the building has been re-roofed, or at least the roof repaired also in the last couple of decades. And I mean, you wouldn't want the school system throwing good money after bad, but by demolishing the thing and replacing it. I mean, honestly, I look at that building and think, why would any school system consider tearing down a building like this unless it truly had no use for it anymore? That's, I think, when buildings really become threatened. Buildings are adaptable. If you need new facilities for a school, and you have land on which to build new facilities, and I think there's land available there, if you needed to expand a school, for instance, or create the kinds of spaces it doesn't have right now, it could be done. And so I understand that people might be concerned about the future of the school, but it seems to me that the combination of its location, its quality, and its historic value and aesthetic value add up to not too much worry. I mean, I don't worry about it when I look at it in comparison to a number of other schools around here.
But Albuquerque had the lack of wisdom to tear down the Alvarado.
Albuquerque learned a lesson when the Alvarado was torn down. But let's be clear, Albuquerque didn't tear down the Alvarado.
Not the city, but the community allowed it.
It was torn down, and it wasn't, its loss, I think, resulted partly from people's lack of belief that it would be torn down. And once the decision had been made, or the decision was made known to the public, it was really too late to reverse it.
Yeah.
because it was a private decision, not a public one. So, because of the fact that it's been 45 years since the Alvarado was torn down, and nobody I ever mentioned the Alvarado to hasn't said, what a shame that was. I think Albuquerque learned its lesson. But it's a lesson that bears relearning and has to be relearned sometimes.
You said that when you came in '81, that the commercial district in Nob Hill was on hard times, lots of vacancies. How do you think that strip, that commercial area, avoided the wrecking ball?
I think the sort of down days of the 1980s and the fact that the buildings survived that time are partly attributable to the fact that lots of different people owned the properties. And probably at that point, few people were paying off the mortgage on them anymore. So it was mainly a matter of being able to afford maintenance and taxes on the buildings, even if they were vacant. And there's always hope, I think, when you have a property, an investment property like that you're going to be able to lease it again or use it again, and you won't just dispense with the improvements because you're tired of paying taxes and maintenance costs. And I suppose that had something to do with it, and maybe the fact that it hadn't been too long that it had degraded. It hadn't degraded over a 30-year period. It was more like a 10 or 15-year period. Mm-hmm. And that's not too long a time. So my guess is it just had to do with that multiple ownership,
Yeah.
and also the fact that the maintenance costs and taxes on the properties weren't all that high in most cases.
And I've heard that depression kind of came about because of the interstate highways. They drained the intercontinental traffic off of Central Avenue.
It's often said, and it's probably true, that places like Nob Hill suffered as a result of an interstate road being put through the city far enough away that there wasn't any way to capture the traffic that had once come right through on Central Avenue in this case. And that's probably true, probably undeniable, but I also think often about the fact that Nob Hill's commercial district was not built just to serve Route 66. It was built to serve these neighborhoods. Most of the businesses in the area were not highway-oriented businesses. They were local offices and retail shops, that sort of thing, that people living nearby could get to conveniently and easily. And the highway-oriented businesses, while there are plenty of them, to me are actually the exception in Nob Hill, not the rule. Certainly the motels qualify in that way, the gas stations, a few other maybe car dealerships we could say, and some of the cafes, but many other types of businesses existed here. And they were dress shops, they were insurance agencies, the pharmacy, the dry cleaner, on and on and on. There were many neighborhood-oriented businesses. And take the Nob Hill Business Center in particular, that place was full of neighborhood businesses, not highway-type businesses. It was designed to accommodate cars with a front side parking lot and a rear parking area and passages to connect the center court with the parking at the periphery, but the businesses were neighborhood businesses. The grocery store, the shoe repair, the pharmacy with the cosmetics counter. And so I think that's proof enough that at least in that early post-war World War II period, the place was oriented to the neighborhood more than to the highway. And now for my my personal story,
Okay.
to the extent I'm going to tell it. I moved here in 1981 from Lawrence, Kansas, which is where I had gone to college and then lived for a few years. And I'd come to Kansas, actually I was born in Kansas in 1949 in Wichita, where my father was an aircraft mechanic at Boeing Aircraft, and my mother was a registered nurse. And we moved to St. Louis when I was 8 years old or so. I went through high school there, and then I returned to Kansas to go to college. And I studied architecture, got a degree from the University of Kansas, and then worked in various design-related and construction-related jobs, and taught a little bit before moving to Albuquerque. And it was only after coming to Albuquerque and 1 year of teaching that I got serious about creating my architectural credentials. And I went to work in a few firms over a 3-year period and got registered. And it was within a year after being registered as an architect that I lost a job in an economic downturn and needed a job. And I found a job in the state Main Street program. And that's what started what turned into a 27 or 28 year government career for me in state and local government.
Why did you come to Albuquerque?
Well, we came to Albuquerque. I came with a woman who became my wife, and we came here because of some intangible reasons, I think, and some reasons that had to do with the fact that it looked like a good place for us, a good fit for us in terms of opportunity. It's a bigger city than the one we were living in. As I mentioned, it had a more freewheeling character to it, although we didn't really understand that at the time. But we both traveled in the West, and Michelle had come out here as a child because she had an aunt living in Albuquerque and visited a few times. And she liked the Southwest. I'd been out in the Southwest once and liked it very much. I was in Arizona, but Albuquerque seemed like a place that we could agree to come to. We sort of knew we wanted to move elsewhere from Kansas, but when it came to alternatives, we didn't have a whole lot of alternatives that we both could really say, yeah, that sounds good. And Albuquerque was one of the places that seemed to make sense to us. So we came here in '81, as mentioned, and enjoyed for a few years anyway, visiting with Michelle's aunt and her husband. She was still alive at that time and had moved up to Jemez Springs, so we got out into the countryside a little bit. We had a friend in Taos, still do for that matter. We went up to see her fairly often. And then, of course, when I started working for the state in 1985, I was given the opportunity to travel statewide, and I did for my work for 10 years, actually. And then in 1995, got a job at the city of Albuquerque in the planning department and settled down a little bit in terms of travel. And my daily commute became quite a bit shorter at that point.
When you were working for Albuquerque, you were involved, I think, in the survey of Monte Vista, of all the residential parts of Nob Hill. Can you tell us about that? Why did that happen? How did it go? How was it funded?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I took that job at the city of Albuquerque in the planning department, and the position is called historic preservation planner. So that's why I got the job. That was my area of emphasis in my career at that point, and it's the kind of work I like to do. So I took the job at the city of Albuquerque. The city had already set off in the direction of inventorying and taking stock generally of historic areas built during the 20th century. And for instance, when I came into the position in late '85, there was already a project on the table, and that table was the evaluation and the establishment of Albuquerque's That is identifying individual buildings and districts in Albuquerque whose orientation and design were related to the American roadside. And Chris Wilson was the historian working on that project. I worked with him as the city representative, as the manager of the grant funds that paid for the work. And then as a follow-up to that, and by the way, that project identified a lot of properties in Nob Hill. Chris had worked with students at the university to do the survey work on both commercial buildings and residential buildings. And that work, that student-assisted work, turned into two major projects. One was the automobile-oriented commercial development documentation, and the second part of it was the suburban residential growth of Albuquerque document, which was performed in following years by fine historian David Kammer. And David, again, worked with grant funding that came from the federal government through the state of New Mexico to the city of Albuquerque. I was the manager of that grant, and it was pretty clear early on that the best place to identify and nominate historic districts under that suburban residential growth context was right here in the Monte Vista and College View neighborhoods. That together, these two neighborhoods constituted a National Register eligible historic district. And so David hired on in not just 1 year, but over a sequence of 2 or 3 years, as it turned out, because we did a sort of a first go at this historic district and found out after submitting it to the authorities that it wasn't quite what was desired or what was appropriate. Actually, to tell the truth, we didn't draw the district big enough to satisfy everybody. And in particular, we didn't draw it big enough to satisfy some residents and property owners right here. That we were somewhat conservative, and we were working on advice from the State Preservation Office here, but we were somewhat conservative in drawing a boundary that didn't include all the buildings it might have included. And by that I mean residential buildings. So we actually had to take a second go at it. I think what we did was we generated that historic district document, and we got it listed on the state register. But in order to get it submitted to the National Register, which is a decision the state has to make, we needed to expand the district. And we did that in the subsequent year or couple of years and created the historic district that exists now in the state and national registers both.
What do you think stimulated the city or the state to want to do that inventory, the one you talked about in the first part?
Well, it begins with the National Historic Preservation Act, which passed in 1966, which created the responsibility in every state to open and operate a historic preservation office with an officer and to inventory historic properties in each state and make appropriate historic designations, submitting them to a state register in most, if not all cases, and then also to the National Register. And that same act provided for grant funding to pass from the federal government to the state to local governments for the accomplishment of the goals of the National Historic Preservation Act. So the city took on its responsibilities by joining what's called the Certified Local Governments Program. That was created in an amendment of the National Historic Preservation Act. And I think it was 1986 when the city became a certified local government and got in a position to receive an annual grant from the state, whose funds originated at the federal level. So in comes the money every year at a certain funding level. The city writes a grant proposal, makes an agreement for that money, and then delivers a product at the end of the federal fiscal year, or by the end of the federal fiscal year. And so we bought off a big chunk here in a historic district with more than 800 buildings in it. And it took a lot of field work by David Kammer in particular. Of course, some of that field work had been done by students in the first place, but it needed to be updated and improved for use in a historic district nomination. Excuse me, I've got to stop and put a lozenge in.
Sure. So where would we go back to just a little bit?
Well, you might, I'm trying to think what I would say about it, but this whole notion of doing a historic district nomination depends on the willingness of the people who live in it to put up with it. And it might be worth saying at this point that this historic district is one in which it does have state registration, it does have national registration, but it is not a locally designated historic overlay zone in which design review is conducted.
What happens when a neighborhood is a historic overlay zone?
Well, the city of Albuquerque has its own ordinance, the Landmarks and Urban Conservation Ordinance, that allows it to create local landmarks and local historic overlay zones in another category called urban conservation overlay zones, and to govern, allows the city through its Landmarks Commission to govern the alteration of properties in those zones and landmarks. And this is a designation that carries a lot more control than the state register designation or the national register designation. The state register designation is the state's business, and it means that in terms of regulation, it's only when public money is being used to affect a state registered property that consultation with authorities is required. And it's like the National Register. If a federal undertaking is planned for a National Register property, then consultation with authorities is required. But in the case of a historic overlay zone, which is a local designation, it doesn't matter who's funding the project. The local Landmarks Commission has authority over exterior changes on properties in historic overlay zones. And in some cases, publicly owned landmarks, it even controls some interior features. But for a neighborhood like Monte Vista or College View, if it were a historic overlay zone, and neither of them is, you would have Landmarks Commission review required if you propose to alter the exterior appearance of your house. That kind of control is exercised in Huning Highland Historic District and in the Old Town Historic Zone in Albuquerque, the 4th Ward Historic District, and the 8th Street Forester Historic District, as well as the Silver Hill Historic District, which is the one university neighborhood where you have Landmarks Commission control locally based.
Quite recent.
Relatively recently enacted was the Silver Hill District, or Silver Hill Historic Overlay Zone. In fact, it was in, I believe, 2008.
What kind of impacts do you see in those historic overlay zones? What has it done? Good, bad, otherwise?
Well, looking at, across all the historic overlay zones the city of Albuquerque has designated, I think it's fair to say that we have avoided some inappropriate new construction in particular in some of those zones, and assured that whatever changes property owners have made have been made according to guidelines adopted for each of the zones And each one does have its own set of guidelines. So those are always created with the involvement of property owners. They are not mandated from above by the government. It's done in a process that includes public comment and input. And my sense of it is that it's worked quite well, actually. That owners, while they may not always agree with the decisions of the Landmarks Commission, that looking across a number of years in each of the zones at a number of different types of projects, that people who live and work in those areas and own property in those areas would agree that the overall character of the place has been strengthened. And this is something that's often discussed in the question or in the process of deciding whether to enact a historic overlay or to make a property a city landmark is this going to improve anything in terms of the quality of life in the neighborhood, the value of the property in the neighborhood, and the people with the most comprehensive view of these kinds of things. And I'm thinking of certain consultants who look at these kinds of designations and look at the health of neighborhoods nationwide and even beyond the borders of the United States, say that the local historic district, or rather a local historic overlay zone, is the best way in a historic neighborhood to avoid severe deterioration of the quality of the neighborhood and loss of value. And I'm not an expert in that area, but that's what the experts say. that this combination of local ordinance-based control and sensible design regulations, historically based design regulations, are a sound means of maintaining the quality of a neighborhood.
When you walk through a historic overlay zone and then you walk to the neighboring area that's not a historic overlay zone, do you see a difference, better or worse, in either one?
There are some places in which a historic area is adjacent to, say, an area of similar age, and you can tell when you've crossed the border between the two, between the area that is controlled for historically appropriate design and the area that isn't. And there are other cases where you really can't tell, and at least I can't. But I'm familiar enough with Albuquerque's historic zones and the areas around them to say that I think that there is a perceptible, if you understand, if you're attuned to the kinds of details and the kinds of design issues and the appropriateness of changes that people make on their buildings, you can actually tell an area that's been controlled over a period of years, and I mean quite a few years, because it takes a while to see the effect. But you can tell the difference between an area that's been controlled and one that hasn't. And it's evident. It's evident in the kinds of changes that occur on buildings. In historic zones, you tend to avoid drastic sorts of changes using materials that are not characteristic of an area, using building proportions, perhaps, and also in how buildings are added to. That's a big issue in a historic area. If you need to expand a building, whether it's your house or something else, how that's possible is, or how that can be done appropriately, is, I think, better controlled in a historic area. It is addressed as a central issue in historic zone design guidelines.
Is the Landmark Commission pleasant to work with? Do they make things miserable for the property owners?
The Landmarks Commission at the City of Albuquerque has a number of its own property owners. I mean, let's begin with the fact that the commission, by the ordinance that created it, has to include members of certain professions: architecture, history, real estate, the legal profession. Planners are supposed to be included on the commission, and probably a couple of other things I'm not remembering right now. But the point is that this is not a citizens committee made up of a group of people who simply volunteered for the job. It's a commission charged with a duty. It's a public duty, and they do it. I mean, to the best of their understanding and within the rules written for their use, they do very well at it. That doesn't mean that occasionally people aren't upset with them about their decisions or think they're difficult to work with. It's often, I think, simply in the eyes of the applicant, whether a commission is easy to work with or not. Because sometimes what applicants want to do is clearly inappropriate. And if they're unwilling to change their plans, then they find themselves at loggerheads with the commission, and they're probably going to get a decision they don't want.
When you and David Kammer and Chris Wilson and lots of students, and I understand even some neighbors volunteered and helped, you all surveyed much of Nob Hill and probably lots of other areas too. I think, I know you surveyed lots of parts of Albuquerque. Then, how did you arrive at nominating Monte Vista and College View and not, say, parts of University Heights like Richmond and Wellesley and Bryn Mawr? What was it that stimulated you to go this way?
Mm-hmm. The decision to nominate Monte Vista and College View as a historic district, as opposed to some of the other areas that might have been chosen, was based on the survey conducted over a number of years by students, volunteers, UNM professors, and other historians. And frankly, the decision was based on what the National Register tells us about what a historic district is. You know, it's a place where,
Let me pause you for a second. I
yeah,
filled my card.
So you'll go back to, you did the survey and then you decided which areas to nominate.
yeah.
Build a card. This is very pleasant, very enjoyable, very informative.
Good.
I know this is going to help the community to understand a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And move ahead in a
Do you want me at
positive
some
way.
point to start talking about some of the changes I've seen in this neighborhood that could have been avoided with
Yeah.
historic overlay zoning?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At some
sure.
point, I'll have to say something about that.
So go
But-
back to,
but
you
back to the
completed
survey
the
and all
survey, or not completed maybe, but
Yeah.
did the bulk of the work.
Well, I didn't do it. It was done pretty much before I came along. But the Monte Vista and College View Historic District was identified as the best example in Albuquerque of the suburban residential growth phenomenon in Albuquerque between 1916 and rather 1904 and some later date, which I'm not remembering.
Would
At
it be
any rate-
1957?
It might be, but something tells me it's not.
Okay.
At any rate, the historic district was defined based on the National Register guidance for historic districts, which says, and I'm paraphrasing this, that a historic district is composed of a number of entities, and that can be a small number or a very large number, by the way, that are historically related, that have a physical form that coheres. That is, there is a strong concentration of historic resources in one area, and that, well, this is getting down into the details, but a certain percentage of the buildings in the area are of the period, still have their historic integrity, meaning their original appearance is more or less intact. That kind of issue goes into deciding where a historic district should be drawn. And in this case, it was evident that this 800 plus collection of buildings north of Central Avenue and within these two suburban additions had a stronger concentration of buildings from a certain period, that it retained its historic character better than the alternatives in Albuquerque. This one was picked first because it looked like the surest thing when it was time to present it to the state register and the national register. And that's what you want. I mean, you're introducing a new historic documentation project, in this case, the suburban residential growth of Albuquerque. And you're going to find your best local example to present with it, to register under it. That just goes without saying. And it was pretty clear, and it's not my decision, it wasn't my decision to do that. Originally, it was in the hands of the historians. They said, this is the place. You know, our students have looked at this, we've looked at this, the neighbors have helped us, and it's evident that right here is the making of a historic district. And we'll deal with the other possibilities later on. We need more survey, for instance, which was the case at the time. We need to survey more buildings in other neighborhoods. But we surveyed here because we saw something here that was more solid, more complete than we saw elsewhere in Albuquerque.
And now there are some other early 20th century suburban additions that are listed, right?
The city has, through its years of conducting historic survey and registrations, nominated and successfully registered several residential areas from the early 20th century. And those include Silver Hill, which was registered in 1986 originally. Spruce Park neighborhood, just west of the UNM main campus, is another example of a residential area from that period. It's listed in the National Register. Monte Vista and College View came along later, maybe because they are somewhat later in terms of their development, their chronological development, but also because they're much bigger. This was a bigger task to get these two neighborhoods registered as compared to Spruce Park or Silver Hill, which have maybe 100 buildings each or 150. We're looking at 800 here. And it's simply a more demanding job.
You mentioned that when the original Monte Vista and College View boundaries were drawn, and this was put out to the public or to the state, some of the Nob Hill residents wanted to be in it. They weren't in it, they wanted it. What was that about? What happened there?
The expansion of the original boundary of the Monte Vista and College View district was made at the behest of property owners at the south side of the district, mainly ones south of Campus Road. Actually, the maps of this are in the city's files. We kept the maps that showed the original district boundary, if anybody ever wants to see that. But it had to do with a few people saying, why did you leave us out of this? Why would you leave us out? And in some cases, they were talking about their own property, and in other cases, they were saying, but these buildings south of Campus Road and up on the side streets that connect to Central Avenue, they're the same kind of buildings we see on the north side of Campus Road. So why weren't they included? And we had no ready answer for that, frankly.
Why would a person who had been left out want to be put in?
Well, I think in at least one case, a property owner wanted the same tax advantages that would accrue to owners of people whose properties were inside the district. Because the state registration of these districts creates the opportunity for a private owner, a taxpayer, to claim income tax credits against expenses that they make to rehabilitate or maintain or repair their historic building. And that's right at the bottom line. You have a certain amount of money to spend to maintain your property and keep it habitable. And if you can get a little bit of help on your tax, either for a fairly substantial project or a small thing like re-roofing the building, then that's in your favor. Why not go for that?
Can you tell us, when did that 50% tax credit, New Mexico tax credit start, do you know? And
I don't know exactly when it started. The state has had a tax credit or a tax-related benefit for historic property owners for some time. But for a while, it was based on property tax. There was a tax abatement, basically, on historic properties. And it was changed at some point to an income tax credit based on expenditure, which of course is a good thing because it helps stimulate the spending of money on the properties.
Right.
It creates an incentive for rehabilitating and repairing them properly, which is what you want in a historic district or on an individual historic building.
Would a little simple house contribute to a historic district?
One of the things about historic districts that's important to understand is that it's possible to create a historic district listed in the state register, listed in the national register, even if none of its individual parts is significant by itself. So a historic district is a collective entity in which there may be some more significant buildings or properties, and usually there are. But the point is that a whole group of entities that are historically related or architecturally related, but are not necessarily significant on their own, can be registered as a group. That's a historic district at its kind of base definition.
I don't have a question at the moment.
Okay.
What else do you have on your mind?
Well, let me think about that a second.
And Joel often has very good questions. Please feel free.
Yeah, Joel's keeping his own counsel over there. I wonder what he's thinking about some of this on camera.
Trying to avoid sneezing at the moment.
Okay, well, let me think about this neighborhood for a second. Oh yeah, well, just to take up that point about historic district, registered by the state, registered by the national government, in comparison to the historic overlay zone, which is designated locally by the city of Albuquerque in this case. Actually, after we got this building registered by the state and federal governments, the planning director came to me and said something to the effect of, well, aren't you going to go for an overlay zone on that historic district? And I said, well, I don't know that we are. First of all, I'm not the boss of this department, and you might want to decide that for yourself. And second, when you create a historic district with 800 plus buildings in it, and you intend to perform design review on the alterations of those buildings, then there's an implication for your staffing level. There's a cost to doing that, and the cost comes out of the public pocket. And at the staffing level we had at the time, and which still remains at the city of Albuquerque, I'm not sure we could have pulled off the design review function of 800 more buildings. Because at that time, the total number of buildings being reviewed for design changes by the city was probably 800 or 1,000 at the most.
It would double.
Yeah. And it was never made a historic overlay zone. Since that time, Silver Hill has come in as a historic overlay zone, but it's quite a bit smaller, and they were able to absorb the additional work to be done there. The long-term effect of this, of course, is that there's nothing to prevent, other than regular zoning rules and such, some completely discordant building designs from being introduced in this district or these neighborhoods. There are a few examples, I think, of that already. Some of them happened before the historic district was registered, where you have buildings that really don't conform to the neighborhood model, let's say, or standard. And I'm not saying this is bad, but if the goal is the preservation of a historic appearance, then clearly the introduction of new discordant elements in the form of new buildings or alterations can add up to loss of historic character over time. And it's a community's decision about whether that's okay or not okay with them. But in this case, the decision was made, or, you know, there's an old saying, not to decide is to decide. In a way, we didn't decide to do a historic overlay zone here. We didn't decide not to. We just kind of left it alone. And absent any strong pressure from the neighborhood, which says, you know, we think we really would be better off long-term with a historic overlay and the design controls that it brings, then the city of Albuquerque is not inclined to do anything like that.
You talked about a character, something about a character zone. What's the name of that, and what does that mean?
The third category of overlay zoning that the Landmarks and Urban Conservation Ordinance provides for.
Let me get you
Mm-hmm.
to clarify the third. There's
Yeah.
the
Okay,
what
I'll
are
just
the
start.
three, and then what's
Yeah.
the third?
The city's Landmarks and Urban Conservation Ordinance allows for the designation of city landmarks, historic overlay zones, and urban conservation overlay zones. The third category, urban conservation overlay zone, is the only one of the three which is adopted only after the local owners of properties in the area request it. In other words, because it's not historically based, there has to be an owner movement or an owner intention to protect the character of the area. The character of the area has to be defined, but it doesn't have to be defined in historic terms. It can be in architectural terms. I'm not sure what all categories it could be defined in because I haven't read the ordinance lately. But the point is, it's the one of those three categories, landmark, historic overlay, and urban conservation overlay, that depends on owner will rather than on the public value of historic preservation. And and now that I've said that, I'm trying to think. We have an urban conservation overlay zone. I just can't remember where it is. I've been out of the job too long.
Maybe it'll come to you, and you can.
I think it will.
Or if not, we can
Yeah.
incorporate it.
That's something to ask Mary Ellen about. She knows what it is.
You mean in Nob Hill?
No, it's
Oh,
not in.
you
Knox
mean
Hill.
elsewhere?
Yeah,
in the
somewhere,
city. There's
somewhere
just
in the
one.
city. There's just one. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Were you around when the city acquired the De Anza Motor Lodge?
Oh, yeah. Oh, good. I'm glad you brought that up because it reminds me of some of the things I wanted to say. While I was working at the planning department, the city acquired a couple of historic motels, one of which is the De Anza Motor Lodge. And to this day, I guess, the place still isn't under rehabilitation. It was certainly the city's intent to get it fixed up and back in service much sooner, but I understand now that finally there's a plan in place, a developer selected, and a solid plan to move ahead. dealing with the De Anza Motor Lodge and other historic motels in Albuquerque has been one of the more interesting parts of my job in its last years at the city. And that's because of the people involved in it all. And I'm going to have trouble doing justice to this subject because it lasted for several years in my case, and a lot of different people became involved with these motels. The De Anza in particular, it resulted in a local organization taking on the task of gathering oral histories about the property, advocating for its preservation, creating a film about the place, about C.G. Wallace, the original builder and owner of the place, and his relationship with Zuni Pueblo and his role as an Indian trader and marketer of Indian goods. Just a wonderful story, or bunch of stories, that have been gathered up and presented as a result. Something tells me that wouldn't have happened if the city hadn't purchased that property and made plans and selected developers to try and rehabilitate it. So that's been while a frustrating process in terms of the amount of time it's taken and the number of what I'll call false starts we've had, that's been a very interesting process to watch and participate in. Probably more interesting to participate in than to watch. But it brings to mind another historic motel, which isn't standing any longer, the Aztec Motel up at Central and Aliso, and the fine family who operated that place in its last year, Shoki and Mohammed Natha, who ran the place and whose tenants decorated it, and who, I should add, were some of the most hospitable people on Route 66 for people traveling to experience Route 66 heritage in Albuquerque. The Nathas made people welcome at their place, fed people, and enjoyed having them every time. So that's another aspect of my work at the city that was so gratifying, dealing with folks like the Nathas, dealing with everybody who got involved and still is involved with the De Anza Motor Lodge. And then, of course, lots of individual owners as well. I think back to when I was working at the state in the Historic Preservation Office, the Greens, who own the William Leverett House, I got to know them a little bit. They've been strong advocates for this neighborhood and its preservation for a long time. And people are too numerous to mention. There are lots of fine experiences on my list here. One of the things that I monitor just casually and yet care a lot about is the change in design, the change in the character of not just the residential districts, but Central Avenue, where as a result of the Nob Hill Main Street program back in the 80s, we had some voluntary design guidelines that finally, after 2000, took the form of some fairly general guidelines that were written into a sector development plan so that they weren't simply voluntary anymore. There were some controls placed on altering certain categories of buildings. And whether we're talking about new construction or the alteration of existing buildings, one of the points I want to stress about the commercial district in Nob Hill is that, to my mind, over the last, let's say, 30 years, there's been a substantial loss of architectural character in the commercial district. And it has to do with, in some cases, little remodeling after little remodeling after little remodeling, and it's almost unavoidable in a place where there isn't any sort of design control, because the nature of the place is that you have a fair amount of turnover in businesses, and a new business coming in is oftentimes going to want to establish its own identity. And in some cases, the identity that's been established out there is really kind of, I think, contrary to the subtle but exuberant design quality that was existent in almost all the buildings in 1985, say. In 1985, before Nob Hill started to revitalize, the original character of most of the buildings was intact, and there was a lot of beautiful but simple, relatively simple brickwork, tile work, stucco texture, variation in materials from one building to the next, to the next, to the next in the neighborhood. And these days, a lot of that has sort of been blended in, stuccoed over or painted out, and in other cases actually replaced with what have to be described as garish remodeling jobs. And I think that's one of the things that has disappointed me about the area, frankly, about the revitalization, is the lack of awareness. Even though the original Nob Hill Main Street guidelines called attention to the subtlety, even down to the subtle colors used in the area, is that nowadays you have quite a bit of what I'd call visual non-neighborliness. In other words, the original character of the place, all the buildings, they were varied in appearance, even though they all used similar materials: brick, stucco, tile, terracotta, that sort of thing. But they all sort of look like they belong together. And now you have a place where you still have a fair amount of that, but you also have some really discordant parts, I think. And I find that unfortunate. I wish that could have been avoided.
There's a couple forces that are making life hard for Nob Hill retailers.
And what are those?
Well, the internet is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Internet marketing.
Yeah, it's
And
not.
big
It's
box.
not just hurting Nob Hill retailers.
It's hurting all brick and mortar.
Sure. Sure.
The other one is the big box.
Uh-huh.
So what is the hope for retail in Nob Hill?
I'm anything but a retail expert, but to me, there's an obvious challenge for brick and mortar stores in the age of internet commerce. The thing is that in a place like Nob Hill, which is, of course, one of the most valued commercial districts in this city and in this state, let's put it in those terms too. It seems to me that there's an opportunity for businesses in Nob Hill based on the collective effect of Nob Hill. It's a place to come, a place to see and be seen, and of course find goods and services that you may not be able to find elsewhere. Back when Nob Hill Main Street was still operating in its original form between 1985 and 88, some really sharp consultants were brought in here from out of town who pointed out that you, as the business person in Nob Hill, have an opportunity to do something for your customer that he or she can't find anyplace else. And it came down to personal service, frankly. Is the quality of service you offer your customer is going to determine whether they come back.
The proprietor himself or herself.
Yes. Just in the context of a retail store, one of the people who advised Nob Hill Main Street, actually it was a married couple, Doyle Hyatt and Dolores Palma, Dolores Palma. And they wrote up what they called a business plan for business districts and offered it to the neighborhood. But I remember Doyle saying something like, if you're going to sell a pair of shoes to somebody, let's say they're fairly high quality shoes, they're shoes that presumably the person can get elsewhere from another store nowadays by internet purchase. And you have some clear examples of sales over the internet, shoe sales over the internet that are, a juggernaut without any question. But he said, if you're having to compete with somebody who sells that shoe for a cheaper price elsewhere, he said, then your only hope for getting that customer to come back is either his sense of loyalty or something you can do for him that he's not going to get elsewhere. And that little premium, you purchase something from me, I'm going to give you this as a benefit, whatever it might be. It's a gift certificate for a meal in the neighborhood. It's the sort of cooperative, it's creative marketing. And if a place like Nob Hill can't get something like that working for itself, then maybe it doesn't have a good future. The point is, it's a district. Everybody's in it together, and it behooves everybody to try to work together to strengthen the place in every way possible, visually, service-wise, making sure the city keeps up its end of the bargain with public infrastructure.
Yeah.
The whole works. And I have to say that I've already sort of criticized some of the design work that's been done in the area, but some really good design work has been done in the area too. I think about simple things like providing more parking, on-street parking, on streets like Amherst with the 90-degree parking where there used to be parallel.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been done on other streets as well, the side streets, is the city has done, maybe only under pressure from the neighborhood businesses, but it's been done. There's been a lot of reorienting of things in the public right-of-way to make things work better. There have been new traffic signals introduced to make pedestrian safety better. It's taken time for some of those things to occur, but they have been done so that I think from an overall perspective, the revitalization has been quite successful in making a place where the special quality remains and other necessities have been brought to the place as well. On the safety side, on the convenience side with parking. I'm trying to think now about any other public work in that vein, and I'm not coming up with it, but
The city has built some bulb outs.
well,
at
there's
the
that.
corners, and they've planted them.
Yeah, but
And
that,
they maintain them.
yeah, well, especially if there's an ongoing maintenance burden that the city bears,
That's a big one.
don't underestimate that.
Yeah, no.
Because it's not Albuquerque uptown, but it's, in terms of pedestrian qualities, it's not as safe. It's probably somewhat more convenient to go to Albuquerque uptown, but there's no historic character there. Over here, you're getting the best of that kind of thing, but also another dimension, which is the historic and the aesthetic.
You're making me think of a term, sense of place. Could you talk about that relative to the commercial district and the neighborhoods in Nob Hill?
Well, I guess the thing that stands out to me about the sense of place here is that the commercial area and the residential areas are one place. They just flow into each other. I mean, the most obvious example of that for me is to go south of Central up to Carlisle to any number of the cross streets and just walk down to the commercial area. What a smooth transition with minimal vehicular traffic interference, pleasant surroundings to walk in. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a neighborhood like that? It's really ideal if you value the convenience of the sorts of businesses the commercial area has, and also the very pleasant domestic qualities that are 1 and 2 blocks away in the closest examples. But even 4 or 5 blocks out, you have a very pleasant transition down into the commercial area and back. And, you know, I think about other parts of Albuquerque where anything like that exists. And I'm having trouble thinking of any where anything comparable exists in Albuquerque. I mean, there's some things there's some smaller examples of that sort of pleasant relationship, but Nob Hill has a good long stretch of it. And I think that's partly why it works. It's not just one intersection or a couple of intersections. It's a whole series of intersections in a row from which you can move north and south off Central Avenue into pleasant residential areas in a matter of a few minutes.
Anything come to mind, Joel?
Well, you're talking about this integration sort of thing between, you know, it's kind of unique in Albuquerque to this neighborhood. Do you think it would be, I mean, sounds like you think it would be beneficial for the rest of the city to maybe kind of promote that sort of arrangement? Is there any ideas that you have to help us kind of work in that direction?
Yeah. Well, having a relationship like that begins in a way with the zoning of the land, what's possible to do on a given piece of land or in an area, and then of course also in how different land uses are connected by our transportation ways, our streets, our sidewalks, and other means of getting around. And I think part of the point about Albuquerque is that there are many areas in Albuquerque that have residential neighborhoods very near strip commercial development. I'm thinking about the area north of Manal right now in the Bel Air addition, and that's the Bel Air addition is basically north of Coronado Shopping Center, and it runs down to the west from there. What's the difference between that and this? And the difference is that the development over here in Nob Hill is, for a series of blocks anyway, it's more Main Street. It's got one business next to another, side by side, with not a lot of parking lots interrupting. And if, for instance, the Bel Air addition, or some similar place in Albuquerque, and there are plenty more, where residential areas abut these strip commercial zones, you could create less of a requirement for parking, more of a public transportation alternative, a transit alternative, and then of course safe, convenient passages between the residential and commercial areas. It seems to me you could replicate this or something acceptably like this over miles and miles of commercial arterial, because we have miles of commercial arterial backing up to residential areas in the city. It's just in some places they've been kind of nicely handled, and in most places not at all. In most places it's hard edge between the residential and the commercial, and don't let the two mix in, don't let the two join together the way they can and they do over here. Another example, and I think this is a pretty good one actually, out in the Heights a ways, is the Hoffmantown Shopping Center. Now that is one private property, the Hoffmantown Center, rather than a series of individually owned businesses or buildings. But the center has, and it's right there where Manal meets Wyoming, and it has this sweeping curve in front of it, and it has the building following that curve, but it has passages through the building, at least one, excuse me, that goes through and connects to a public library. Real nice mix of uses, right? A little public use, private commercial, and then a whole quarter section, as we used to say back in Kansas, of ranch houses in the Inez edition. To me, if you want something that just begins to give the quality of the Nob Hill Business Center in a more recent development, that is Nob Hill Business Center to surrounding neighborhood, it's that place out there.
You mentioned individual owners in our commercial district, and the way that the lots were platted or replatted in some cases was this 25, 26, 28-foot lot.
Yeah.
And that rhythm speaks to me when I walk through our commercial district.
Yeah, I think it's easy to estimate how nice it is to have something different to look at every 25 feet or 50 feet for that matter. You know, it's variety. It keeps your interest going. It's stimulating to somebody. And obviously, we're not building too many developments like that anymore, but they are being built in some places. I mean, that's the effect they're trying for in uptown Albuquerque.
Yeah.
And, you know, for what it is, it's a pretty good example of pulling that off. But it is all one owner, and just, it's and of course all under one scheme of management and aesthetics, which keeps the place consistent. It doesn't allow the jarring alteration or the jarring new construction. But of course, it's a little bit homogeneous on the other side of it, on the downside.
You've talked a little bit about some people, and I'm wondering if there were any experiences that you've had in your work that were funny or weird or embarrassing.
Oh, sure. Probably some of each.
I wanted to ask you about David, but I can't.
Yeah, I understand that. Well, I wanted to be sure and mention him because, boy, you know, one of the things about David is that he showed the potential of an urban lot here. Gene, of course, as well. But look what they did with their home and rental property. I'll just go ahead and say some things about them. Might as well. One of the consistent, solid, reliable aspects of my work at the city of Albuquerque, especially in the early years there from 1995 through about 2005 was my work with David Kammer, who hired on as our consulting historian on several grants and performed admirably, from the standpoint of a project manager. But more important than that is that David and his wife Jean Whitehouse showed by example in this College View edition what you can do with a single-family house and a rental property. They had more bird sightings at their one lot in Nob Hill than I probably get at my place in Corrales, where we're known for the wildlife around us. Not to mention the fact that they grew all kinds of varieties of apple, vegetables, peppers. I don't even begin to know what all they grew on their property. Just about everything you can imagine growing out in the backyard and the front yard in some cases. And not only that, but winning awards year after year at the state fair with their arrangements of their produce. Really remarkable suburban residents, I think, apart from the great work they do in history and historic interpretation and such, and in writing. So one of the the real fun parts for me in working for the city was getting to know David better and Gene as well. Excuse me. There are plenty of people, though, in the neighborhoods that I've interacted with over the years, and it's too hard to begin to recall many names, and if I started to do that, I'd be leaving out some people I don't want to leave out. But the nice thing is, for me anyway, just on a personal level, that I got to experience a Nob Hill home or two in my first year or two in Albuquerque, probably my very first year. And so I had a little bit of a sense of the place before moving out to Corrales and out to the South Valley first, and losing touch with the place in a few years in between. But coming back to the city in 1995 to work and being responsible for historic districts and such things put me right back in the thick of it, and it was really nice to be able to do that. And to see also, and I realize this isn't quite in the Nob Hill as defined in the neighborhood, but to work with that area over around Baton Park, and Baton Park in particular, which is a memorial to soldiers lost in battle, and those two who survived the Baton Peninsula activities in World War II. That's been, in recent times, very warming, and for that matter, also an aspect of working in Albuquerque that I think is important to emphasize, which is getting to know different communities in the city. You know, Baton Memorial Park is treasured by the Filipino-American community in Albuquerque. If the city ever decided it didn't want to take care of Baton Memorial Park anymore, and fortunately it's required to do so, but if it ever let down on the maintenance in Baton Memorial Park, the Filipino Americans would take over and make the place beautiful, or keep it beautiful. So that's kind of a sidelight to it all. Let's see, what else can we think up here? That might be enough, huh?
Boy, you've given a beautiful interview.
Well, thanks. I feel like my sort of hinky voice and my halting way of saying things is always a problem in a situation like this. But
You've answered
You
a
do what
lot
you
of
can.
questions that I've had for
Yeah.
a long time.
do you have any others? Any other important ones that you want?
I was curious about the surveys and why they were done.
Yeah.
Now I understand that. I was curious about the nominations and the identification of district.
Mm-hmm.
Curious more about historic overlay zones, which you answered.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very nice. Very, very nice interview.
Good. Thank you.
If you come up with something you say, oh, I forgot,
Mm-hmm.
just kind of put it together in an email if you don't mind.
Right.
And we could actually incorporate it even by way of printing it up and photographing it or
Yeah.
something. like
You know, one thing mentioned in your write-up is the use of visual materials.
Oh, yeah, right.
I wanted you to know that
Yeah.
there are some panels, some exhibit panels that were done by Nob Hill Highland Renaissance Corporation.
Uh-huh,
I think
yes.
it was by them,
Yes.
back when Mary Ann Dickinson was involved with that.
Mm-hmm. Right, in the mid-2000, 2005 plus or
Yeah,
minus.
probably in there. Those panels came to me by way of Matthew Terry,
Yes,
and I took them down to the Special Collections Library
okay.
because I didn't have any good use for them and wanted to make sure the public could get access if anybody wanted to see them. If you're looking for any kind of interesting visual collages, you
Yes.
might consider asking for a look at those. Another thing I have, which is not, it hasn't at least not yet been donated to anybody, is I have a panel or two from the Aztec Motel, meaning one of those plaque, those assemblages of tiles
Yes,
that Phyllis Evans put together and hung on the Aztec.
yeah.
That also came through Matthew Terry.
Yes,
And,
Matthew demolished the Aztec for us.
yeah, well,
How sad.
that was a tough one to save. I really wish that he and Jerry Landgraf, and I'm not going to fault Matthew alone for that, because he and Jerry Landgraf went out and bought all that property with Jerry's money. And Jerry was smart. When they split up, he gave the Aztec to Matthew because he knew he couldn't figure out what to do with it. Those guys, if they'd worked out as a partnership, and if they'd been more creative and more focused, they could have saved that place. But they just didn't have it. They didn't gel. And Jerry, it turned out, he hadn't ever had any experience in real estate development, so he was going to have kind of pick his way and stumble a few times. And
He did do a modest restoration on the Nob Hill Motel.
yeah, well, they spent a bunch of money on the place, and it's not a bad job.
No, it's not.
In fact, it's quite acceptable, I think.
Yeah.
Even though it's not up to historic preservation standards quite. It's pretty good.
Yeah, I agree. I appreciate them doing that.
Mm-hmm. That was about the one thing that worked out well with them. I mean, well, I'm sure Jerry has some other good things going now, but it's unfortunate that they didn't get sort of either limit their scope at the first or work separately, work with people they were compatible with.
2008 happened.
Yeah, of course.
That was what changed everything.
Oh, I know.
Especially for people like that who owned a great deal of undeveloped
Yeah,
property.
yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate the way things have gone in several areas, but what are you going to do? With some things we have control
Well, that
of,
was
and others.
Yeah, that was unavoidable. Well, it happened. I don't know if it's unavoidable,
Yeah.
but it happened.
Yeah,
But the nice thing for our commercial district and our neighborhoods is that this serendipitous chain of events has left us with some beautifully preserved historic
mm-hmm.
districts and areas.
Yeah,
And many, many people are becoming more and more aware of that and more committed to protecting
Right.
that sense of place.
yeah, I agree. Well, if you want to find examples in Albuquerque of people who, really do get involved in neighborhood and city civic work to improve neighborhoods, you'd be hard pressed to find a better example than this area, in my opinion. But it's this area, including some of the other university neighborhoods, in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But you look, starting at Silver Hill and the struggles they went through,
Yeah.
and still do to some extent,
Yeah.
and right up the coal and lead corridor, really, really solid and fortunate areas and people. The money that came through for lead and coal from the federal government wasn't a sort of a complete balancing of what happened in 2008, but it was a really great deal for that side of the neighborhood.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
And all the way down into Union Highland, because it runs that far. I used to, when I was still, I guess, working with Oasis on walking tours, and maybe when I just started with lifelong learning, I did a few tours up in Nob Hill, and it almost always involved going up the hill to Carlisle from the Nob Hill Business Center or the church, and then down Letter Cole and back in that area.
Mhm.
And it was so dangerous, it was so lousy as a pedestrian experience
Yeah.
on those streets. And now it's pleasant and safe and lovely. That's the kind of thing that I'm so glad has followed the private sector investment in this area,
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing that won't usually happen unless the private sector comes in and sort of creates a need for better public facilities. And I don't know what to compare over here. I mean, I'd love to see Lomas Boulevard get a little better treatment than it's gotten.
I'm under the impression that that was once called Los Lomas, and that it was one lane less each way.
Yeah,
Because now the houses on Lomas
that's
are
right.
very close.
No, exactly right, Gary. This is the same thing with University Boulevard, except that they actually took houses out to create University.
Oh, really? That was
Yeah.
called Plum Avenue or something.
I
think.
forget what it was, but you know that some little street got obliterated to create
took out
a
houses?
material. Yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah, yeah. The old aerials make this clear, and Las Lomas is right. I mean, if you go down to University and head into Spruce Park, you're on Las Lomas, and it's right on line with this. They had to create ways to get people out to the heights as that all filled up with houses.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've heard from several people that lead and coal were once called Coal and Highland. There was no lead.
Oh, really?
And then they built this coal aqueduct, and that became the big one-way. And then they called that coal, and then the other one that had been called coal, they called lead. And there is no Highland.
But there's always been a lead downtown. That was part of the original town site.
But not up here. They
Yeah.
were Highland and
Yeah, that
coal.
makes sense. There's been a lot.
And they
of,
were little streets just like Marquette or Roma.
yes.
That's what they were
There's been a lot
intended
of
for.
name changing around the city, sure.
Well, how'd you like to see a little 1930 Mediterranean?
Oh, then there's that place on Amherst. Yeah, let's see what time we have.
You got time?
Well, I want to make sure I do.
Joel, do you have time? And if you don't, I mean...
Oh,
I'm getting close.
it's almost noon. Okay, so I've got a 1 o'clock haircut appointment.
You do? Well, then we'll give you a 15-minute look.
Yeah, take a
And
quick
Joel,
look.
no obligation, but you're very,
Where?
it's 2 blocks over, and it's a 1930 house that we're restoring.
I don't know that I'll be able to stick around for that.
I think you can see that at the big open house in a couple of months.
Oh, yeah, the big open house. Now you're talking with
Yeah.
refreshments.
With even maybe some ethanol refreshments. Very good, Ed.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me. That was fun.
I'll tell you, we've been saying for at least the last decade, we've got to get some of these stories down.
Yeah,
And now, thanks to our 100th birthday,
it's a great idea.
we had a good stimulus, you know?
Yeah, sure.
Well, Joel, if I take Ed over there, all you need to do is maybe you can lock this one and then just go out the side door there and just pull the knob closed.
Okay,
That's all we need for security here.
sounds good.
Nice to meet you, Joel.
Thanks so much. You did an
Thank
excellent
you.
job there. It was quite a story.
We had that coffee. We'll take that with
Yeah,
me.
don't forget that.
I wouldn't want to mess up this nice clean house.
Joel will be, putting out the raw video on YouTube, but you need the URL to find it, so I'll send you that.
Okay,
And
great.
you can look at that, and then we will edit this to 25 minutes, and then we'll be able to,
Okay.
I know we'll use this to show to the community, to teach them about HOZs.
Yeah.
Because
Well-
I think that we're building enough steam to make another run at that.
Yeah, you know, the best